in the Territorial Army. In government, his expertise has been put to good effect. Having served in a number of capacities at the Ministry of Defence, most prominent of which was Minister of State for the Armed Forces. Mark left the government after Theresa May was appointed Prime Minister. And now serves on the Defence Select Committee. Having made his maiden speech opposing the Nice Treaty, Mark campaigned strenuously in the referendum campaign and is now Vice Chairman of the European Reform Group of Brexit MPs. He has warned the Prime Minister that Chequers does not represent Brexit. And that he and north of 50 Conservative MPs will vote against it. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome Mark Francois, Member of Parliament.
Mr. Chairman, councillors, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. In fact, Boris is here with us today. Look, well, I'm here to tell you it's outrageous that Mark they still tell the story in my constituency of the Boris selection. And I won't go through it all with you now for reasons of time. But it was an epic occasion. And the electors of Henley, when they picked Boris, made the right decision. Hopefully, the electors of Rayleigh did in my case too. Now, thank you very much for inviting me to address you at a very important and very timely conference this afternoon. I hope I had more luck with you than I did when, as Minister of State for the Armed Forces, I visited the headquarters of the Intelligence Corps at Chicksand in Bedfordshire. And I spent a whole day with them, and the last engagement I had before dinner was to meet a group of junior NCOs who had just completed what they called the basic intelligence course. And I'm chatting with these corporals, and I said to one of them, "Corporal, what was the final exercise on your course?" And he looked slightly uneased, nervous. And I saw these glances being exchanged, and I thought, hello. I'm on for something. So I put on my old platoon commander's voice, and I said, "Corporal, what was your final exercise?" And the chap rose up. "Well, sir," he says, "as you asked, the scenario we were given was that you, Minayev, were visiting a police station in the West Midlands, and we had received a credible intelligence tip that there was a threat to your life. So the task of our syndicate was to provide intelligence and security advice to the West Midlands Police to protect you for the duration of your ministerial visit. And at the end of the planning phase, we ran an exercise to test it." "Oh," I said by now. "What happened? You got killed, sir." So I said, "Oh dear. Did that affect the outcome of the course?" "Oh no, sir, we all passed." Now, I had been a political journey. I began my political career on Basildon District Council in Essex. Quite a robust place to learn your trade. Once described as the only local authority in the United Kingdom where at council meetings the councillors actively heckle members of the public gallery. And then, as my kind of apprenticeship season, I fought Ken Livingstone in Brent East. 1997. Not so easy. But I think it is fair to tell you, privately, today, that I had Ken worried. Just another 16,000 teensy-weensy little notes, and I would have done it. But I then served in the Territorial Army for 8 years. I was privileged to be an infantry officer in a fine regiment called the Royal Anglians. And in June 2001, I was elected to the House of Commons as the Member of Parliament for Reading, now known as Reading. And I made my maiden speech on the 4th of July 2001 against the Treaty of Peace. I thought you may as well start as you mean to go on. And it's always a little worrying when politicians quote from their own speeches. Nevertheless, in the House of Commons that night, this is what I said. And I was talking about the 1975 referendum. I said the British people were essentially told that they were assenting to a free trade area, a common market. And that is what they endorsed in 1975. The further we move from that position, the greater the risk that we should exhaust their patience in all things European. We are an historically tolerant people, and we are willing to negotiate and to cooperate. But we will not be subsumed by a foreign superstate that ignores our traditions and that undermines our laws. Well then, here we are. Over the next few years, the moves towards federalism in the European Union. We'd already seen the treaties of Maastricht and of Amsterdam. Then we had Nice in 2001-2, and then Lisbon in 2007. All of them ratified by Parliament. All of them without consulting the people in a referendum. But what finally did it for me was the Treaty of Lisbon. A 300-page treaty, further expanding the power of the European Union over our country. And again, no referendum. And I remember the second reading debate on that treaty. As the Shadow Minister of State, it was my job to do the treaty, as it were, in detail. But William Hague, my boss, did the second reading debate. And you can still get it on YouTube. Some of you may remember this bit, when he was teasing the Labour Party about the prospect of Tony Blair becoming the President of Europe. And it went something like this. He said, picture the scene as the cavalcade of the President of the European Union sweeps majestically into night, and out of the car gets the European President, Tony Blair. And standing up the steps of Downing Street with a rictus grin on his face is the Prime Minister. And the two men shake hands and pose agonisingly for the photograph. And then they are led into the cabinet, and the officials withdraw. And they are alone. And the whole psychodrama begins again. When the Prime Minister leans forward to the President of Europe and says, I want your job. We spent 14 nights debating that treaty in Parliament, and we couldn't change a single punctuation mark in it. Nothing. And I confess, that's when I crossed the river. I thought, after all that, we have got to get out of this. And that's why I campaigned actively for leave in the 2016 referendum. I'm sorry we only won by 1 million votes. We should have tried harder. The people of this country who voted for this more than they've ever voted for anything else before gave us, to my mind, a very clear instruction in 2016. And Parliament then voted overwhelmingly to leave by triggering Article 50. On the 29th of March 2019, we argued to leave both under EU law, under Article 50, and under UK law, under the EU Withdrawal Act, which passed through Parliament just prior to the summer recess. Now, it's important to remember that the Tory party's 2017 manifesto endorsed this process and reiterated, and I quote from the manifesto, "As we leave the European Union, we will no longer be members of the single market or the customs union." But all of my Tory colleagues, from Andrew Bridgen, who was my warm-up man earlier, to Anna Soubry, who has never warmed me up in any context, voted for that manifesto and stood for Parliament on it. However, I regret to say that the negotiations have not been well conducted. They have been driven in reality by a small coterie of very pro-EU civil servants in number 10 Downing Street who have never accepted the result of the referendum. Never. There has been little consultation with the Cabinet. I said on the Victoria Derbyshire show, when I could get a word in, that the Cabinet had been treated like mushrooms because they've been kept in the dark and fed. I said, as I was walking out of the studio, my phone went bananas. What we have seen, I'm afraid, is a Cabinet barely involved in this process. The whole thing run through number 10. And we have seen concession after concession. I said we've seen concession after concession after concession for absolutely nothing in return. This has been a rolling capitulation that is not worthy of this great nation. First, we have the 39 billion for nothing. Then we have the backstop. And now we have the backstop to the backstop. Or not. Then we have the transition period. And now we possibly have the transition of the transition, which would last even longer and cost us even more billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Again, for nothing in return. At a time when my colleagues have had to put up with the closure of police stations in their constituencies, at a time when our schools, and I know this and my own head teachers, are under real tough budgetary pressure, it is proposed that we give even £1 billion more of our hard-earned taxpayers' money to the European Union for the privilege of walking away from the organisation in the first place. And the House of Lords European Affairs Committee, not a bastion of Euroscepticism by any means, in fact, if anything, the opposite, have gone into this in extreme detail. I mean, the Lordships have the time to do that, and they concluded that we don't owe the EU legally a penny. So if we accept Schengen, we would become a rule taker under the so-called common rule of laws. We would have to maintain equivalent standards in social policy, the environment and employment policy. We may still, it's not clear, be tied into the common fisheries policy during the transition period, something our Scottish MPs have made plain they could never accept. With regard to the Irish backstop, it looks as if some kind of arbitration procedure would be recommended so that we could not unilaterally withdraw, even if Parliament voted to do so. we could be locked in a temporary customs union forever. And remember that French saying, nothing endures like the provisional.
Like what?
The provisional, not the IRA, the customs union. So clearly, we would not be masters of our own destiny. We would be left, in effect, half in and half out. That would be, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, a recipe for chaos, which does not in any way honour the spirit of the referendum. Now, the European Research Group, of which I have the honour to be the vice chairman, chaired by a man called Jacob Rees-Mogg, have consistently advocated a positive alternative. Because a couple of months ago they were saying, well, you haven't got a plan, you've got no alternative, you're just negative what we do. It's called Super Canada. It would be a comprehensive free trade arrangement with the EU, and it's called Super Canada because it's based on an existing free trade arrangement between Canada and the EU that was signed in 2016 after a number of years of negotiation. And you take that, so you've got a template that's already been haggled over, you take that and you add on a few additional matters like maybe a security protocol and a protocol on data, and you then have Super Canada, and I believe that would serve our country and the EU from its viewpoint very well. And we have tried remorsefully, and I use the word deliberately, again and again, to persuade Number 10 of the merits of this option, but they're not listening. Despite the fact that Donald Tusk back in March said the EU would be very happy to agree a comprehensive free trade agreement. And even Michel Barnier said in April much the same. And a few weeks ago, Tusk reiterated this offer in a tweet, such as more diplomacy conducted. But I'm afraid at the moment, Number 10 are not listening.
Why is that?
Hang on.
Why?
Hang on, sir. I'm not from Number 10. I'm from the House of Commons. Now, no one can be sure, but it does seem that we're now quite close to a deal. It feels, after all these months, in fact, after 2 years, that we're now not very far away. And I pay tribute to Joe Johnson for having had the courage to resign from the government on a point of principle over Chequers. Chequers would have to be approved by the Cabinet and then put to the Commons in principle in a so-called meaningful vote. Well, it'll be meaningful, right? It will probably be the most important thing that the MPs currently in the House of Commons would ever vote on in their entire lives. And remember, it is not a secret ballot. The division lists will be published in Hansard in the usual way. And everybody in this country will be able to see how any member of Parliament have voted on this crucial issue. There will be nowhere to hide. It would be, for this generation of politicians at least, effectively the equivalent of the Norway debate. The Norway debate. It wasn't a debate in Norway, it was in the House of Commons. Now, here is my view. I cannot believe that Conservative members of Parliament, drawn from the same party that produced Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, will vote for an agreement that would make the United Kingdom a vassal state. I yet hope and believe, particularly after Joe showed leadership yesterday, that members of the Cabinet will have the moral courage to oppose this awful deal. But if they do not, then it will be up to Conservative backbenchers to do the job for them. And I am absolutely confident that in that scenario, we already have sufficient numbers to do just that. often say that politicians use weasel words or don't make plain what they mean. Let me see if I can do better. We haven't yet seen the final deal, but if it is pretty close to everything we've learned about Chequers in the last few months, then when it comes to that meaningful vote in the House of Commons, when the bells ring and the time comes for every member of Parliament to be counted, then here's what I will do. I will go into the no lobby of the Commons and I will vote against Chequers with a clean conscience and a happy heart. So in conclusion, let me say this. Down the centuries, this country has fought again and again to defend its freedom. We are not about to forget this.
Louder, louder.
We are not about to forget that lesson now. Ladies and gentlemen, the destiny of our country is in the balance. Chequers is a disaster, and we will chuck it.
Thank you for that sterling performance and the determination that you have shown to all of us that you are a man of principle and will carry through your promise to vote against this fake deal. Incidentally, I can see why they chose Mark rather than Boris. Mark is funnier than Boris. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Patrick Minford of the Cardiff Business School. Patrick has been taking on the economic establishment in this country for 40 years and coming out on top. He was promoting Thatcherite economics before Thatcher. He supported the 1981 Geoffrey Howe budget, while 364 other economists wrote to the Times calling for a U-turn. He opposed shadowing the Deutschmark and joining the ERM. After our ejection from the ERM, he became one of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's 6 wise men. How appropriate. More importantly, Patrick, you have consistently argued that Britain would be better off out of the European Union. You have produced 2 editions of Should Britain Leave the European Union? An economic analysis of a troubled relationship. During the Brexit campaign, you were a prominent member of the Economists for Brexit group. You've got banner headlines in the national press for saying that predictions of a recession, if the UK votes to leave the EU, are based on bizarre assumptions. There cannot have been many occasions in your life when you have been proved right so quickly. Patrick, you are now chairman of Economists for Free Trade, who are doing invaluable work. You and your colleagues have demonstrated that leaving the EU and trading under World Trade Organization rules will produce strong economic growth in the medium term for the United Kingdom. Patrick, you have always had the courage of your convictions. Our politicians seem determined to ignore the obvious, and their obsession with a 1950s style customs union frankly beggars belief. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome one of our most forward-thinking economists, Professor Patrick Minford.
And thank you for your kind words. And also, thank you, Mark, for a very stirring opening set of remarks. I want to kind of move away from the current government proposals. But first, let me just echo what Mark said. We don't know, of course, exactly what's in them, but it seems to be a sort of a hodgepodge of possibilities, from checkers at one end to something maybe a bit more like Canada Plus at the other end. But the main problem is that we've got no control over this. And it's clear that what these proposals do, however they come out, be very damaging to the UK, because we'd be tied to European rules, EU rules, almost certainly also the customs union, because of what Mark pointed out, that we can't really get out of it. Even wishing to get out of this at the end of the day would not apparently be possible without agreement from the EU, which doesn't give them much incentive to agree to a sensible Canada, super Canada type agreement. And so it's likely that we won't be able to negotiate free trade agreements with the rest of the world, and it's also likely that we will be more or less permanently tied to EU rules of the single market, which include rules that cover the whole economy, social, environmental, and labor laws. So this is really not getting out of the EU at all. But it's worse than that, because while we would still be in the single market and the customs union, we would also have absolutely no voice in the rules that might develop over time. So that these rules could get a lot worse than they have been up to now. And we would have no way of stopping it. So quite clearly, it's not just the status quo, it's actually worse than the status quo, because the status quo, at least we have a voice, and we could potentially head off some of these rules and other policies on standards and customs. But if under these proposals, we won't even have a voice to stop the worsening of these rules. So it's worse than the status quo. The second point, I think, which emerged as well from what Mark said, is that these proposals can't get through the House of Commons. And so, I obviously, anything, it's possible that enough people could be browbeaten by various threats, but I think highly unlikely, given what we know about the principles of the DUP and also the European Research Group. So I think that we've got a set of proposals which extraordinarily have virtually no chance of getting to the Commons. Now, it's obvious that there's a new approach needed. Now, I'm not going to talk about who does it. I'm just going to talk about the government. I don't know who will be this government that would fashion this new approach. But if you can't get something through the Commons, you've got to do something different, haven't you? Now, so what could this new government approach be? Well, the idea of Super Canada is certainly something that a new government approach would embrace. And it seems to me that what a new government approach could do would be to offer a choice of this Canada Plus, or whatever you want to call it, which is a free trade agreement from the outside of the EU, with the EU, like a third party. Or it could say, well, if Parliament and the EU will not, either of these, won't agree to it, then we will go to the default position, which is sometimes called no deal. But no deal is not actually an accurate description. What it is it would consist of agreements on all the sort of administrative things that have got to be done anyway, visas, citizen rights, aviation, all these things that people talk about. All those things have got to be agreed anyway by bilateral government agreements between our government and that of the EU. But what a no deal would include, because this is the bit that can't be agreed, would be going to trade on World Trade Organization rules. No trade deal with the EU. Now, this we would call this a world trade deal, because really it's us deciding that we will go and do our trade with the EU on world trade rules, World Trade Organization rules. And this is actually the default position if, in fact, the government can't get anything through the Commons, because then the only thing that can happen, actually, is bilateral agreements on all these administrative things which have to be done, and this, moving to World Trade Organization rules. And then, I think, in offering this choice, the government must make it very clear that the position is that any deal, any trade deal, or any deal of any sort, the sort that Mrs. May is currently discussing, must be better than no deal, or at least as good as no deal. Now, the surprising thing is very hard to beat no deal. And what I want to say this afternoon is that, no deal is a benchmark that must be beaten by any deal. And this benchmark, a robust new government approach which makes this a benchmark, would ensure that we get a proper Brexit, because obviously no deal is, by definition, a full Brexit. Now, and so any deal that, is agreed has got to be at least as good as this. Now, how good is no deal? Or by which I'll call it a world trade deal, because what I want to emphasize is that it is actually the rule of law. If you listen to the BBC, it says things like, we would crash out of the EU, like sort of someone falling out of the sky with a parachute that won't open. But, of course, the whole point about no deal is that it is law. There are laws. There's international law. And the problem has been with the government's approach to negotiating is that instead of setting this benchmark that anything's got to beat this no deal. It's basically rubbish, no deal. I mean, if you listen to the Chancellor, he has totally misunderstood no deal and has gone around rubbishing it. And so has Mr. Clark, the business secretary, and various others. So what the government has done is meant that instead of going to the EU and saying, look, if you don't do a deal with us that makes sense from our point of view, we'll go to no deal. And they've said, we can't possibly go to no deal because we'll be just in terrible shape. And so the EU naturally has said, well, you won't do it then, will you? And so the government has deliberately sabotaged its own negotiating. Now, it's therefore very important to understand what a world trade deal or agreements on everything else, but no explicit trade deal with the EU, but a deal under World Trade Organization terms, what it means. Because until that's understood, and the politicians involved internalize it, they'll all go along saying this same thing when they do any sorts of negotiations or any sorts of statements to the House of Commons or whatever. So what is no deal? In fact, no deal is economic, in purely economic terms, the best deal. And I say this completely unambiguously because what it does, it's actually better, strictly, in economic terms than Canada Plus. In strict economic terms, it's better than Canada Plus. But I support Canada Plus or Super Canada, provided it is a genuine free trade agreement which doesn't bind us into, like the Chequers one does, into all sorts of rules and so forth that are nothing to do with us. I would support, Canada Plus on the grounds that, if you've got a neighbour, you want to be on good terms with your neighbour. And so it's worth having an agreement that, actually is strictly speaking a little bit less good than no deal, just because you want to be on good terms with your neighbour. And that's the position with Canada Plus. It is actually worse for it's better for us to be under no deal than it is to be in Canada Plus, but for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But, often you do things to be nice to your neighbour because you want to get on with your neighbour, and it's worth a few bob. And a few bob is the difference. So, let's just go through the various points about no deal. First of all, what are WTO rules? WTO rules have developed enormously since we joined the EU in 1975. They are now very elaborate in terms of ensuring good behavior between neighbours, such as ourselves and the EU. First of all, they give us full access to the European Union single market. And as Michael Caine says, not a lot of people know that. There's this great myth that's gone around that somehow you can't sell into the single market, if you don't, if you're outside the EU. This is, of course, absolute nonsense, and we know that, in fact, non-EU trade has grown much faster with the EU than EU trade, because country after country has had complete access to the EU's markets through the simple fact that when the EU sets standards, if you match those standards, you can sell to it. End of story. And there's no way in which the EU can sort of say, we've got these standards, but if you satisfy them, because you're sort of Russian or, English or something, you can't come in. That's actually illegal. So that's the first point. And the second point is that we've heard a lot about border frictions. Borders have to be seamless under EU rules. There's a thing called the technical specification, trade specification restrictions agreement, which says that borders must be seamless. That means that virtually everything is pre-cleared by computer. And when it arrives in port, it just goes through. And it doesn't matter whether it's from the EU or from the not EU, provided it's been notified to the customs and they know what it is, through it goes. And to do otherwise, you know, we heard Mr. Macron, the wonderful Roi Soleil of France today, tell us that, oh no, you know, the port of Calais would be a problem for us. Well, the next day, pretty much, the president of the Calais region said that he wasn't having any of that, because actually the port of Calais is a very important business for Calais, and it would be completely suicidal if they were to behave in such a way, and it would lead, and we know in fact it would lead to massive lawsuits by businesses against the port of Calais, that they would not be doing their duty, their commercial duty. So that's the first point. And we come now to the next point about a no-deal situation, a world trade deal situation. There are tariffs. Now, there are tariffs because they average about 4% between us and the EU. And they're not very big, but the truth of the matter is that putting on these tariffs would give us a benefit and would cause damage to the EU. Good. Let me explain why. If under a proper Brexit, we would do free trade deals with the rest of the world. Prices in the UK would drop to world prices. And we would remove this EU protectionism. As a result, then, EU exporters exporting to us would face our tariffs. It's not something we particularly want to do, but if there's no deal, that this is what the rules say you have to do. And so those tariffs would give us revenue of 13 billion. And who would pay it? EU exporters, because what they'd have to do is match the prices in our market, which would be world prices. And they'd have to absorb the tariff and pay for it out of their own margins. Because otherwise they wouldn't sell anything here, you see. So that would be 13 billion to the Treasury a year. That's not chicken feed. And as for our sales to the EU, well, we would sell at world prices, just as we sell everywhere. We'd sell everywhere at world prices. And EU importers would have to pay the tariffs that they themselves impose on our goods, because we're going to sell it at the world prices anyway. So the price inside the EU would just go up by the tariff, and that would be paid by the importer. Now, that means that the 5 billion or so that the EU would levy on our goods would be paid for by their own citizens, their own importers. So, 13 billion to our treasury, 5 billion they would levy from their own people. And the third point, so the point about the tariffs is that they're not something we want to do, but under WTO rules we would have to do them. And we would take off any tariffs on anyone with free trade agreements with us, of course, and go to zero on those tariffs for the rest of the world. But if the EU won't do a deal with us, we charge them tariffs. It's the corollary of them not doing a deal. So that's tariffs. Now the third point is, with no deal, there's no transition. There's no 39 billion. Because the whole point about the 39 billion was that we said it was there because at the end of the day, if it was a full deal, we'd pay out of goodwill and we'd stay in a transition for a couple of years, which would be most of that 39 billion. But obviously, if there's no deal, there's no transition. And there's no 39 billion. And also, Brexit would come 2 years earlier in all the other ways that we're talking about. So that's a big gain for us, getting the whole thing on lost to the EU because they stopped charging us excessive prices 2 years earlier on the stuff they sell us. And so, when you add this all up, it means basically that, if you discount it to present value, it costs the EU 500 billion. These tariffs, the 39 billion, bringing Brexit forward, it costs them 500 billion in terms of a one-off equivalent of what these things cost them over time. And it gains us 650 billion. And this is why it's better than Canada Plus, because under Canada Plus, we pay the 39 billion, we have the transition, and Brexit comes 2 years later, and there are no tariffs. So this is the nugget, if you like, that we would give up with Canada Plus, but we give it up because we want to be good neighbours. So, finishing up on no deal. What do we hear from the Treasury? We hear from the Treasury, oh no, Calais will be blocked. Nonsense, illegal. There'll be disruption. Illegal. So, what the Treasury is saying is the EU behaved illegally. But if the EU behaves illegally, they lay themselves open to massive lawsuits from their own citizens, because what a lot of people don't realize is that all this international law is embedded in EU law, so that businesses expect other businesses to abide by these laws. And so if they don't, if the Port of Calais suddenly starts to play hooky, they'll face a lot of lawsuits from their own citizens and our companies too. And those, in the end, will be policed by the European Court of Justice. Isn't that amazing? So you see, disruption, this is just manufactured stuff by the Treasury, which is, as Boris Johnson said, the heart of Remain. Why the Treasury is the heart of Remain is another story which I can't possibly go into. But, we can imagine what it happens. Now, what other repercussions will there be? Well, will there be a recession? I expect someone will say that too. The Treasury thinks there'll be a recession if there's no deal. Nonsense. The Treasury has a good record on recessions, doesn't it? Nonsense. And so, the basic point is this, that no deal is the best deal. And our government's got to go out there freshly with a blood transfusion to make it robust and aggressive. And it's got to tell the EU that it's going to be no deal unless they can do something sensible in the way of a Canada Plus. Because, yes, we would like to be good neighbours. We're happy to sign up to Canada Plus. We don't want to make their lives completely miserable by no deal. And so, we're friendly people who will kiss them on both cheeks, even though they've even tried to kick us in the nuts. Capable of doing it once we've got this particular thing. I mean, if I were the government today, I just wouldn't bring this to the House of Commons because it's transparently clear it can't get through. And then they can make a fresh start along the lines that I've said. And then, it's all good, because after a few years of this, when we're out, the EU will obviously want to do a deal. So they will come and ask us for a deal.
Thank you very much indeed, Patrick. That was really a brilliant statement. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Dr. Gerard Lyons. Gerard has had a distinguished career in the City of London, having served as Chief UK Economist at the Swiss Bank Corporation, Deutsche Credit Bank, and Standard Chartered Bank. On numerous occasions, the Sunday Times has awarded him its top forecaster accolade. He really is the best. From 2013 to 2016, Gerard acted as Chief Economic Advisor to, yes, it's that man again, to the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, and advised him on economic and financial issues facing the capital. Gerard played a prominent part in the Brexit campaign, being co-founder of Economists for Brexit, including producing the e-book, The UK Referendum, an easy guide to leaving the EU. In September 2017, he and Liam Halligan published Clean Brexit, How to Make a Success of Leaving the EU. I just don't know why these people aren't invited to number 10. They argue cogently that no deal really is better than a bad deal, that it's not essential to strike a free trade deal with the EU by March 2019, and that all preparations must be made immediately to trade under WTO rules. Well, I don't think they're listening, Gerard. Gerard has also spent this week in Shanghai at the Import Expo, where he found the mood towards the UK to be very positive. Gerard, we thank you for returning to address our conference today. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please give a very warm welcome to Gerard Lyons.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Barry, for a very kind introduction, and thank you to Robert as well for inviting me. Actually, Clean Brexit gives me a chance to plug it, as it's near Christmas. This is definitely a book given the audience where you not only can buy it for your friends, but you can also buy it for your enemies. And it's available from Bite Back Publications. Anyway, it was mentioned that I co-founded Economists for Brexit. I wasn't part of the official campaign, but I'm delighted to say that Patrick Minford, who I have great respect for, and I co-founded Economists for Brexit. At the beginning of the referendum campaign, the Remain side was 23 points ahead on the economy. On the day of the referendum, they were only 1 point ahead. We'd like to think it was down to us, but George Osborne also played his part. And it's a great pleasure to be able to be on the same podium as Professor Minford and also Mark. What I'd like to do is focus first on reminding us why we should be outside the EU. Second, then I will focus on the economic issues, and third and finally the implications. But first and foremost, why should we remind ourselves that we should be outside the EU? Well, in the current debate, people seem to be forgetting all the challenges and all the problems confronting the EU. As Barry mentioned, I was in China this week. One of the real challenges is for both the European Union and the UK to reform themselves in a changing and growing global economy. The speech given by Xi Jinping, the President of China, last Monday, could almost have been the speech you would have wanted a US President to give. His focus was on free trade, opening up the global economy, focusing on innovation and inclusivity. Challenge for Western Europe is that the EU is one of the least innovative parts of the global economy. But the real reason why I think we should make sure we remind ourselves that we need to be outside the EU is that ultimately it's a political project. 27 of the 28 countries within the EU approach it from a political perspective. It's only here in the UK that we tend to approach it from an economic and financial perspective. Moreover, in the last year, President Macron, in the wake of Britain voting to leave, basically said the European Union either needs to become a political union or it needs to have a core and a periphery. Some people are claiming we should re-enter the EU. Why would we do that if it's quite clear that they're hell-bent on the direction of becoming an ever closer political union? When we were in the EU, when we argued largely from an economic and financial perspective, lest we forget, the EU was always reluctant to reform. Prime Minister Cameron asked for very little in his renegotiation and was offered even less than in return. Moreover, that renegotiation is key about the future direction of travel of the European Union. Prime Minister Cameron asked for the non-Eurozone economies, of which Britain would have been one, to very much be differentiated from the Eurozone economies. Both the Germans and the French then said non. It was very much about the Eurozone driving the project. Also, we're the most service sector economy within the EU. Along with the Swedes and one or two others, we tried to make the single market work properly in services. It doesn't, because it didn't really reform. Moreover, the EU fails to address deep-rooted economic problems within itself, between the north and the south. Moreover, it fails to address issues such as migration. And as we saw this last week with the Dyson legal case, it clearly is more a German-run Europe rather than Europe-run Germany. So if we were outside, would we really want to join? Even the European Commission points out that 90% of global growth in the next couple of decades is likely to come from outside the European Union. Moreover, even the IMF, who thinks we should stay in, predicts that the European Union will be the slow growth region, along with Antarctica, in the world economy. The economics of the EU are built on very shaky foundations, namely the euro. But also one of the things in the present debate is that we keep being told trade is an important part and the EU is a force for good. The reality is that there are many countries, much smaller than Britain, who, with far less commercial and far less diplomatic influence than us, have struck a range of free trade agreements bigger in size and scope than those of the European Union. We have the ability, if we want to strike those deals outside. But to conclude this part, it's really going back to the era of the Soviet Union. There was a book by Alexei Yovchev, and he used the phrase hyper-normalization to describe the last days of the Soviet system. Now, I'm not saying the EU is like the Soviet system at all. It's very different. It's very open in many other ways to the Soviet system. But in those days, the phrase hyper-normalization came to mean that people recognized the system was failing, but no one could imagine an alternative to the status quo. Everything was forever until it was no more. And that's the challenge with the EU. People keep thinking it can't reform, it mustn't reform. They keep continuing on the political project, but the inbuilt economic imbalances ultimately will force a big day when the system itself ultimately needs to become a political union to survive or start to fall apart. Therefore, what do we do outside? We have to leave the single market because it gives us lots more room for manoeuvre. Only 6 to 8% of UK firms sell into the single market. They account for 1/8 of the UK economy. They're largely the bigger firms, hence we hear so much from them. But all UK firms, small, medium, as well as large, have to conform to EU rules and regulations. Moreover, the 4 freedoms are part and parcel of the single market. And therefore, if we don't cut ourselves free from the single market, we will not be able to set our own migration policy. Moreover, we will have to continue to front up some sort of cost. There are many people in the present debate arguing still that we should be close to the single market. And as Patrick touched on, in terms of the customs union, the customs union effectively has a tariff wall around it. Its origins were to protect the German car industry and the French farming industry. That's why the tariffs are highest on autos, 9.6%. That's why the auto sector is keenest to remain in. But also it explains why food, clothing and footwear attract the highest tariffs alongside autos of goods coming into the UK. It's only outside the customs union that we will be able both to set our own tariff structure, as Patrick touched on, and trade globally under our own free trade agreements. Now, the challenge, of course, is in economic terms, there can often be a cost of changing. It's not easy to leave something that you've been in for over 40 years. Moreover, some firms, particularly those big firms, have predicated their business model on the UK being inside the EU. Also, the coalition government a few years ago produced a whole series of competency reports. I read many of them. They were thick publications, and they highlighted how intrusive the EU has been into most walks of UK life. That helps explain why it is such a challenge to leave. Also, the mindset of young people has become very much influenced by what they've become used to. But there's this myth that young people will do well if we stay in, and it's only the older people who want to leave. The reality is, the Home Office a few years ago produced a very interesting analysis on where do people leave the UK to go to. If you're seeking to retire, people go to the European Union. If you were seeking to leave the UK to look for a job, you don't go to the EU. You tend to go to the Anglo-Saxon countries. Moreover, high rates of youth unemployment are evident across much of southern Europe. 1 in 2 young people in Greece, 1 in 4 young people in Spain, and a whole host of young people in Italy as well. So there's no reason why the myth that young people will benefit from being in the EU should be allowed to be sustained. It needs to be a challenge head on. What we need, though, is to have a clear vision and a clear leadership and sense of direction to basically point out that many of the factors that we've become used to hearing are not necessarily true. And that's where the big problem, I think, has come in the last few years. We've not had a real global vision being presented to the UK people. So therefore the country has largely remained divided. Within any economy, the outlook depends on the interaction between the fundamentals, policy and confidence. Confidence is heavily influenced by many factors, including certainty and including a vision for the future. You can't actually predict how confidence will turn out, but if there's a lack of confidence, it will deter many people from spending or many people from investing. The good thing, though, in the last couple of years is that the UK has continued to do well in many respects in attracting inward investment. But there's no doubt that confidence, if it was stronger, would lead to a pickup in investment. Now, the economics profession is largely in favour of Britain remaining in the EU. Patrick and I are in a minority. It goes to show that majorities aren't always right. But the economics profession is heavily influenced by groupthink. And also, there's a strong status quo bias. It's basically the cost of changing often means economists don't want to change. And often it comes down to the issue that being able to trade into the single market is costless. But it's not, for reasons Patrick touched on, and I alluded to. The rules, the regulations, and also the fact that we still are able to trade into the single market outside of the single market. Over the last 2 years, the growth of jobs in the UK has defied expectations. Project Fear said 800 jobs, 1,000 jobs would go within 2 years of the vote to leave. That's not happened. Yesterday, GDP figures were at their strongest for 2 years. But there is no doubt that the economy has probably suffered slightly, particularly from the uncertainty, and investment has likely been weaker than otherwise. At some stage, that investment rebound will be seen once we get any exit after next April. But really it comes down to this. For future success, we need to get 3 things right in the UK from an economic and financial perspective. Our relationship with the EU, so it doesn't constrain us in the future, hence all the discussion earlier. Second, our position with the rest of the world. The global economy is going through one of its most dramatic changes ever, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. But third, and very crucially, and an area that's hardly received much discussion at all, is our domestic economic agenda. So we need to basically have a good relationship with the EU, we need to position ourselves globally, and we need to address our domestic economic agenda. This has largely been ignored. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that there are probably things that we should have done domestically when we were in the EU that were outside the EU's control and we could have done that we didn't do. But now we are outside, we will also have at the same time extra room for manoeuvre to set many things right. And it really comes down to getting the I's right. Innovation, investment, infrastructure, but underpinning all of these is the incentive structure. Because regardless of your politics, the one thing that does work in economics is incentives. If you incentivize an economy properly, the economy does respond. And some areas the government might want to intervene, but largely it comes down to rules, regulations, and taxes. And that's what we need to be focusing on. And we can, and we explained in Clean Brexit, do far better outside than inside the EU. Migration. If you believe what the data says, people voted, well, people vote for all sorts of reasons, but people voted primarily for sovereignty, then for migration, and then for the economy. But on the migration issue, migration is good for an economy. But unlimited migration is not necessarily good for an economy, particularly if you do not plan for it and your public services are not there to respond. Professor Bob Rowthorne of King's College, Cambridge, gave some very good testimony to the House of Lords, and there was a Civitas working paper at the end of 2015 or 16 where he talked about the fact that migration was good, but we can meet many of our needs with low tens of thousands migration. But who knows what the number is? But in qualitative terms, we need to have a sensible migration system. Should it be a points-based system, a work permit system, an emergency brake, or a regional migration system? We need to have this debate. I have my own views, other people will have their views. There's no hard and fast answer. There's pros and cons to all of these. But we need to have a sensible migration policy. The City of London. The financial sector is one of the strong points of the economy. There's been a mindset change in the last 2 years in the city. Now, I don't think the Prime Minister helped in terms of her attitude towards EU citizens. I personally think that that could have been addressed immediately and should not have been a bargaining chip. And we should have granted EU citizens rights immediately for those who are here. But for the City of London, it's a key issue because 1 in 8 people who works in the city is from the European Union. So clarity about that is important. But 2 years ago, the big 2 concerns in the city were about something called passporting and euro clearing. I'm not going to go into the details of all these, but passporting is the ability of any company from an EEA country to be able to sell their goods and services, rather, across the whole EEA. The point to bear in mind here is that passporting, in its current format, came into existence in 2007. It doesn't account for London's preeminence as the major financial centre of Europe, and London will be able to cope with any change in passporting. It will impact some firms' business models. Euro clearing. Politicians on the continent think they can split clearing so some of it has to take place in Europe and some can take place in London. Again, I won't go into the detail, but this is self-defeating. Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, pointed out to one of the Treasury committees that if that was to happen, then you would fragment the market. And a 0.01%, so 100th of 1% increase in interest rate spreads in France, if they moved euro clearing to France, would cost the EU alone 20 billion euros a year. A 3 basis points increase, so a 0.03%, so tiny, would cost them 60 billion euros a year. The point is that many of the things that politicians talk about are not in sense practical or sensible from an economic or financial perspective. And as the penny has slowly dropped, the politicians, I would say, have started to ease back in some areas. And there's now widespread acceptance, as many people here thought 2 years ago, that London will remain the major capital market centre of Western Europe. Indeed, in the last 2 years, London has established itself as the fintech centre of Europe. and of the globe. In fact, probably the most significant economic event in the last 2 years was the decision by Google and all the other major tech companies to go ahead with their planned investment in London even after the referendum result, establishing London very clearly as the number 2 tech centre outside of Silicon Valley and the number 1 fintech centre in the world. At the end of the day, financial centres will go to where people want to do business, and they will be influenced by the regulation. What's really happening is global competition, New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, and soon Shanghai versus London. And that's what we need to focus on. And let me come to the final sort of comments. We are now seeing probably one of the biggest shifts in the global economy possibly ever. It's 10 years since the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis highlighted many things, in particular how imbalanced the UK economy was. Even the European Commission alluded to that earlier this year. Every 3 years, the European Commission does an analysis of their 263 sub-regions. 3 of the top 5 are in the south of England. 4 of the top 10 are in the south of England. However, we have the most heterogeneous distribution. The lowest in Britain is Northern Ireland, 145th out of 263. Then it's West Wales and the Valleys, 134th. Cornwall and the Scilly Isles, 133. And South Yorkshire also figures quite low on the list. So London and the South East, and indeed much of the south of England, is incredibly competitive. But many parts of the UK are not competitive. And that imbalanced economy is something that we need to address through our domestic agenda by becoming more competitive. But what's interesting is the global change. We're now having the 4th industrial revolution. We're having the data and digital revolution. And it's very much about how we position ourselves. And when some people say there should be a second referendum, I think they should be mindful of this. When you look globally, there are really 4 drivers of what's changing the global economy. Economic and financial, and we've just touched on that. Hard power, military might. And Britain is more than the rest of Western Europe in terms of military might combined. It's only Britain and France. Then there's institutional power, and Britain is on the United Nations Security Council, it's on all the big global groups. Our institutional influence, if anything, will be greater because we'll retake our own seat at the WTO. But the 4th area after economic and financial, hard power, institutional, is soft power. We have a lot of soft power. But how will autocratic leaders across the world respond to our soft power if, after the biggest vote in our democratic history, we decide to ignore the outcome? Think about the consequences of that. The European Union, finally, is not a castle, it's a prison. It's not a beacon of strength. It's something that once you're in, they don't want you to escape from. The people in Britain have given the Prime Minister and the government and Parliament the key to escape. Let's hope they do not throw the key away, but kick open the door instead. Thank you.
That will be down to the Prime Minister. And clearly to be defeated on a major plank policy of those in the House of Commons, if you're a Prime Minister, is distinctly suboptimal. But as to whether that would lead or not to her resignation, well, in the first instance, that would be a matter for her and not for me.
Thank you. Any other members of the panel wish to comment? Come on,
Some of your colleagues keep pointing out that the Prime Minister is very popular amongst how do you respond to that? No, I'm just interested. It's not to put you on the spot.
Well, on checkers, when the latest opinion poll I've seen is that. Sorry, well, I'll just speak up. Okay? The latest opinion poll I've seen is that a free trade deal, or the concept of the comprehensive, free trade deal gets about 35%. No deal gets about 30 to 35%, and checkers gets 4%. Although remember, there's a 3% margin of error.
Great presentations by you all. Thanks very much. Question for Mark. You agree that Mark that our leader must leave? Who should top three replacements?
Forgive me, sir, but I've only been in the Parliament for 17 years, so I'm just learning the job. But one of the things I've learned is you don't get into hypothetical questions like that. So if at some point there's a leadership election, I won't pick the top three. I'll just pick one and I'll stick with it.
Choose one.
Sorry?
Choose one.
If we have this conference again next year, then you can ask me that one then.
Any other panelists have a preference who might be the next Prime Minister? No. Right, lady in the red top.
Councillor obviously I believe that checkers is the worst of all possible worlds, and I hope that MPs throw it out. I would like to have some reassurance as to the procedure, as to what could come next. If MPs decide to vote checkers down, what would be the next step procedurally, given that MPs have the meaningful decision? Could they force the Prime Minister to go back to the EU? Could they force a second EU referendum? What could happen? I think the last speaker spoke of the danger of throwing the key away. When we almost people had quite obviously voted to leave. That really does concern me, that it might not automatically be a no deal, as I and others very much want.
Shall I have a go? My understanding of the legal position is as follows. The default position at the moment, if there is no deal of any kind, is that on the 29th of March 2019, as I was saying in my remarks, the United Kingdom will leave the European Union. We do that under EU law, as I said, under Article 50, and under UK law, under what is now the EU Withdrawal Act. If nothing else changes, then we leave on those terms. We would trade on WTO terms as a default position, unless and until we then came to some other agreement or deal. Yeah? The only way of stopping that would be by an act of Parliament. So Gina Miller did us all a favour. She established, if you read the Supreme Court judgment, it is extremely clear that you could only trigger Article 50 once Parliament had passed an act. And so it follows you could only undo that by the same method. So there's some talk of trying to engineer some vote in the House of Commons, and the Speaker might or might not be sympathetic to one amendment or another. So, and if you're not going to draw me on the future of the Prime Minister, you're definitely not going to draw me on the future of the Speaker. But even if they were to pass some kind of motion, my understanding is that legally that would not change the situation. We would still leave on the 29th of March under a WTO terms default unless and until someone passes an Act of Parliament to change it. And I cannot see, given the balance in the Commons at the moment, that anybody would get an Act of Parliament through to change it unless it was for super. That's my understanding of the position.
Take a question from that lady on the game. Yes.
This is for anybody in the panel who wishes to answer. Why is Theresa May so stubborn? Why doesn't she see the total opposition that is around her? She is wrapping herself in her rhetoric, in her ideas and everything. And why is she behaving as an uncollegiate, tin-pot dictator?
Well, I think we need one of the economists to answer that one. And then maybe I'll have a go, but we'll let one of the others go first.
Well, I would imagine if the Prime Minister or one of her supporters was here, so this is not necessarily my view, but to answer your question, she would, or they would highlight two things probably. One, that she had put the Northern Ireland issue, border issue at centre stage, so hence she worked almost backwards from that. And, well, actually three issues. One, that. Second, I was going to say her commitment to the auto sector. Big companies lobby very well. They lobby very well in Brussels, they lobby very well in the UK, and they've created this perception that if we were not in the single market, it would somehow be economically bad. So I think that's the other thing. And the third point is a minority government makes it very difficult to... It's the election outcome from last year. But that's what I would imagine she would say. I'm guessing, just having listened to what she and others have said, I don't think it stands up to enough scrutiny. So.
Very clever. Yeah, I'll take a question for Lady by the window there. Yes. You just stand up and the microphone coming on.
Well, thank you very much. Your speeches were brilliant. I appreciate it. I was up at 4 o'clock this morning to get here. I campaigned, as a lot of you know, across Yorkshire, and I am 70, but I campaigned. I'd like to ask you two things. What concerns me is that we've been told this morning that there are nearly 48 letters in. How is it that only one person knows exactly how many letters are in? And secondly, is that democracy?
Well, I think we're guided by the rules of the Conservative Party. You know, those are the rules of engagement in this situation. Now, the only person who knows how many letters are in is Sir Graham Brady, and he's utterly inscrutable about it, quite rightly. I don't even tell Mr. Brady how many. And there have been all sorts of rumours about how many letters there are. I don't know how many letters there are. It could well be that after Joe's resignation yesterday, there's now one more than there were. I just have a sense, without knowing, that there are quite a few. And I say that partly because I know a number of colleagues who have put them in the last 2 or 3 weeks. You know, I actually know it means it's done it. So whatever the number was, it must have gone up.
You put one in?
No. So whatever the number was, it has gone up. It is possible at some point that we will cross the threshold. If we do, then the rules of the 1922 committee, as I understand them, are very clear. The chairman of the 1922 must announce that the threshold is breached, that there will be a vote of confidence, and he then sets the date for that vote, and he becomes, in effect, a returning officer for that poll. Yeah? So he's got no leeway in the matter, and the parliamentary party trust Graham Brady implicitly. You know, he's been a member of Parliament for over 20 years, he's been a minister, we all know him. You know, no one is asking that every week someone be allowed to send in, a review and observer and check how many letters it's got. If it gets to 48, Sir Graham will obey the rules of the party and do what he's got to do. I don't know how many there are, I just know there's more than there were.
Come on in!
Yeah,
If
I can make a few points. First of all, it's obviously not a politician. The last thing you might want is a change of Prime Minister now. Surely, if you have to leave at the end of March, unless there's primary legislation, then one sure way of having primary legislation is to have a change of Prime Minister. Because if you change the Prime Minister before the end of March, then it would seem to me you open up the possibility, maybe the likelihood of a general election, and you certainly open up the possibility of primary legislation, i.e. Parliament having a vote. So what the more sensible thing it would seem to me would be to try and encourage the Prime Minister to actually move from a checkers deal to a Canada plus type deal. Then you can still have that approved through the process without necessarily having changing primary legislation. And also the other point can I make, while we seem to be focused very much on the Conservative Party here, one of the lessons from the early 70s or mid-70s was the then Prime Minister Heath was advised, from what I've been told and read, by Willie Whitelaw, the last thing he should do, then he was trying to get us into the European Economic Community, the last thing he should do is view it from a party political perspective. It was a national issue, you should embrace it from a national perspective. And one of the big criticisms I would have is that in the wake of the referendum, the Conservatives made this a party political issue, rather than making it a cross-nation issue. If one looks at the EU voting, 2/3 of Labour MPs are in seats which voted to leave. There was broad cross-party support to leave the EU. So I think it's more than the Conservative Party issue, and I think that's part of the challenge with the situation.
Give the answer. You've got the microphone coming.
Thank you. Of course, I'd love to ask about Pisco, but somebody else can do that. This is a public interest question. It probably affects a lot of us. So my question, very simply, is how many people have been unjustly silenced by Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter?
In fact, I can just tell you that the earlier broadcast of this meeting has been blocked on Facebook as being against community standards.
Are you pretty sure that checkers can't get through Parliament? If checkers is full
Microphone.
If checkers includes full regulatory alignment with the EU's 22,000 single market laws, surely passionate Remain MPs, including Labour MPs, could vote for checkers. They've never been bothered about sovereignty before. They won't be now. The question perhaps for President Minford, housing costs and migration. Which economists or commentators, when telling us that migration is a net benefit, have included the cost of housing, which has increased at more than twice the rate of inflation?
I think the point about migration is a very good one. The point is that the problem with migration is not skilled workers, and it never has been. And that relates to what Jerry said about workers in the city. And I think the proposals about migration that have come out of the government and come out of the Migration Advisory Committee to the government have said that skilled workers should be basically treated the same way as skilled workers around from the rest of the world, i.e. basically not restricted, provided they've got a job and therefore are required by the economy. The problem in migration has attached to the uncontrolled entry of unskilled workers. There are 1 million EU unskilled workers, plus a couple of 100,000 of their dependents. And they actually cost the taxpayer a lot of money, because they are entitled under our laws to benefits and tax credits. And so, and of course, because they're unskilled, they don't get high wages. They get minimum wages, basically. And so, what we found is that this is a big drain on the exchequer. It's equivalent of a 20% subsidy to unskilled workers. So it's driving down wages of unskilled workers to the detriment of other competing unskilled workers in the UK. And so it is pretty much a disaster for poor people. And one of the things that hasn't been stressed much in the debate on the EU is that by signing free trade agreements with the rest of the world and moving towards free trade, we lower the cost of living for poor people disproportionately. By bringing in controls of unskilled migration, we raise the wages of poor people, quite importantly, and also we take away the big burden from poor people of actually having to give a lot of these benefits directly to migrants who settle in those areas where people live. And so between all these factors, we think that the cost of living or the gain in living standards for poorer people, so 60% of average wages, be about 15% from leaving the EU. And that embraces all these issues that related to migration as well as protection.
Thank you. Just want to comment at all on that question about parliamentary arithmetic.
Yeah. In theory, the whole of the Labour Party could vote for Chequers. I think that's quite unlikely. One, because Corbyn has always been quite a Eurosceptic in his heart of hearts, so is McDonnell. So I think instinctively they'd be very reluctant to do that. And secondly, their whole narrative for the past year or so is that the country needs a general election. So that would completely cut across everything that they have been saying. And they would then have to explain to their own party members why, when calling day in, day out for the end of the Conservative government, they've written to Theresa May's rescue when she was under pressure in the House of Commons. So it's not impossible, but I find it difficult to believe that the Labour frontbench, as a general rule of thumb, the opposition don't help the government out when the government's in trouble. Right? Now there could be, there's been some, to try and give you a fuller answer, there's been some talk of some Labour backbench MPs potentially voting for Chequers. People like Caroline Flint have been mentioned. If that be so, I don't think there are very many of them. Not least because they tend to be Blairite Labour MPs, and Momentum hate their guts. So they know that if they were to quote, say Theresa May, quotes for the sake of Europe, Momentum would deselect them all within 24 hours. So if there are going to be a few of them, I believe there will be very few of them. And just to check if I was right, I had a private chat with a member of the Labour Whip's office who said, I quote, "Yes, we've heard this too. If you've got a list of those people, could you have it?"
That's right. That question really is very much about the state of the land. I'll take the next question here.
My name is Peter Todd. If Mrs May gets her proposed Chequers deal through Parliament, would it be the first time in history that the ship has gone down with the captain?
What was the question?
The question was, if Mrs May got the Chequers deal through Parliament, would it be the first time in history that the ship has ever gone down with the captain? Sir, this ship will never make it to port.
What's the preference? Yes.
Jeremy Mellons. I'm no expert in these things, but the Irish border issue, which we've not spoken about very much so far, it seems to me that the British don't want a border, the Irish don't want a border, nobody in the rest of the world wants a border. In fact, with your military experience, Mark, you'll know we tried to make a border decades ago with 30,000 troops and failed. So there isn't going to be a border, full stop. And yet, why are we running around like headless chickens trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist?
It's an extremely good question. Everything you said is completely correct. I think it goes back to the strategy of Theresa May in these negotiations, and also the strategy of the EU. The Irish border has been made into an excuse to create checkers. Checkers being, as has been pointed out by Jerry and Mark, I think, basically, there is this view that if we don't have a very stay basically in the single market and also in the customs union, there will be a terrible problem for industry. Industry has lobbied very strongly on this, and there was a famous letter that I think Mr. Clark wrote to the auto in Tunisia, which has never been made public. But I think one has to have a strong suspicion that this letter said, don't worry guys, we will make sure that nothing changes for you. And I think this was the result of successful lobbying. It's a result, I think, also the fact that Mrs. May is a Remainer. And what she sees, above all, is the disruption of the EU relationship and the barriers that all her civil servants, again, who are also Remainers, tell her repeatedly will happen if we have no deal, for example. Or even if we have Canada Plus. The Treasury has computed that the costs to the economy will be half as much as for no deal. Can you believe it? Because we won't have this sort of so-called, frictionless links with the EU. And this is what I was trying to say, and I think Jerry also agrees, is nonsense. It's nonsense because there are no frictions under no deal. For the reasons I said, there's seamless borders, and there is full access to the EU if you meet the standards. So I think what's happened is that Northern Ireland has been weaponized, as it's sometimes put, in order to make it possible to force checkers through. And this is because the people involved, the civil servants, I think Mrs. May herself, are convinced that there needs to be something as close as possible to Remain, and that will satisfy industry, which to her mind is the most important, vested interest in the country, and trumps these other points. I think this is based on ignorance. I think it's based on serious ignorance about WTO rules and about trade. A lot of this stuff is out of date, seriously out of date, because the WTO's movements in the last 20 years have been enormous. The WTO has now become the equivalent of a single market internationally, and has really outmoded and outdated all these EU linked arguments. And so I think there's a lot of outdated thinking, there's a lot of prejudice, and I think a lot of this is unfortunately shared by Mrs. May.
Can I correct? Yeah. Sorry. Firstly, I don't know, and neither do any of you, how each individual senior civil servant in Whitehall voted in the referendum. But if there were a referendum, I'd be prepared to bet you 50 quid for Help for Heroes. Not many of them voted me. And the professor has hit the nail on the head. There are a group of very senior civil servants within Number who were opposed to us leaving from the word go, and who will try to influence the process so that we remain as close to the
Hasn't she ever watched Yes, Minister?
Yeah, or Yes, Prime Minister, indeed. So I have a great deal of sympathy with what the professor has said in a far more articulate manner than I did. Just quickly, on the point about Facebook, if they really have blocked this, then that's ridiculous. But if they have, I have some good news for you, and forgive me, that's why I had to sneak out to do some media interviews. And the first thing one of the journalists said to me was, I listened to your speech, Mark, but when are you going to come off the fence? And you might not be on Facebook, which I would regret. I hope this conference tonight will be on the BBC ITV Sky channel.
That's a very important point there, and this connection that Patrick's made with the Japanese car manufacturers is very, very valid. Some of you may remember that Mrs. May met Carlos Ghosn with Greg Clark, Carlos Ghosn, the chairman of Nissan, way back in October 2008. After that, more investment authorised by Nissan in the UK, and the Japanese ambassador thanked the Prime Minister for the assurances that she provided to the chairman of Nissan about the future market access in the UK. So there we are. Now, another question. Yes, gentlemen.
Sometimes Remain is arguing against WTO as a viable option. Mention things like
Closer to your
non-tariff barriers.
Close.
You mentioned non-tariff barriers, supply chains, that sort of thing, difficulty. And also the fact that many of the countries who are WTO countries, in fact, already have well-established trading with. So it's not quite the same thing as entering now without those treaties. It's been great to just comment on that and why they're not important.
Yes, of course.
What was the question?
The question was what about supply chains? What about non-tariff barriers that might come about because of not having staying in the single market in the customs union? And that's the basic one. And also various agreements that the EU has struck around the world, which we would want to renegotiate. I think the point here is that it all goes back to what these non-tariff barriers are. And the non-tariff barrier, basically, there's various sorts. There's anti-dumping, but there's no question of any anti-dumping between us and the EU. It's basically with developing countries with a low cost basis. So it's really more about standards and discriminatory standards. And the basic point is this: the EU sets standards, and we have been part of the EU, so we set the same standards. Therefore, on Monday, before Brexit, all our industries that export to the EU will satisfy their standards to the letter. On Friday, when we left the EU, they will still satisfy those standards to the letter. And WTO rules say that if you satisfy the standards, you can't be denied entry. It's as simple as that. Because to do so would be discriminative. It's really very simple. And so that means that these non-tariff barriers that are talked about lightly by the Treasury and the Department of Business are completely false, because they could happen if the EU behaved completely illegally. But then, as I pointed out in my remark, if they behave illegally, they become the target of business lawsuits across the whole of the EU by affected parties. Not to speak of our own WTO complaints to WTO courts, but more seriously for them, they become the target of these business lawsuits of people because they're not applying the law. And one has to remember the EU is basically an entity completely created by international law. So for the EU to suddenly come around and say, we're ignoring international law, is like committing suicide, essentially. And so that's the basic point about non-tariff barriers. And on the question of these treaties, well, of course, you see, what we're going to do when we sign free trade areas around the world, we're going to have much better treaties than the ones with the EU, because the EU never lets anybody that they do a treaty, a free trade agreement with,
have access to agriculture. Because obviously, or cars, or any of these other major industries of the EU. So all these treaties they've done are highly restrictive. Whereas we want these guys to sell to us. And in return, we'll get more access to our service industries and various others. So actually, our FTAs with the rest of the world would be far, far stronger in impact than anything the EU have signed. And they will be very widely welcomed around the world.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll just now have to take one last question because we're running out of break. I'll take one from that.
My name's Harold Lee. I'd like to echo what Patrick Minford said about the German motor industry. If you look at this year's annual report of the DEA, which is the German motor industry report, there is actually a chapter which basically the industry does not welcome Brexit, but they said they'll work with it and they will make movements across the border of just-in-time work. Now, this is in the public domain. It isn't something which most people would come across, but the only reason I have to know it is because I translated it this year.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, and a particular thank you to our speakers. They put an immense amount of effort into their presentations, and they have genuinely tried to answer every question that has been put to them. And we thank them for what they've done in coming here.